Hello, friends and fellow neighbors, and welcome back to another special edition of Live Like Fred. As always, my name is Colton the Bias, and I am pleased to be joined by two very special guests who I've had the pleasure of interacting with over the past few years. This is Gregg Behr. He is the executive director of the Grable Foundation, and Ryan Rydzewski. He is also a writer for the Grable Foundation, and they just wrote this terrific book, When You Wonder, You're Learning. Mr. Rogers' Enduring Lessons for Raising Creative, Curious, and Caring Kids. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you so much for writing this great book.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, Colton. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Colton.
All right, guys, so let's get started. So, where did the idea for this book come from?
Greg, I'm going to let you start with that one because we've been writing this book for 3 years, but the work itself stretches back a lot longer than that.
That's right. In many ways, the book is 15 years in the making, Colton. So if I take you back to late 2006, early 2007, we had across the Pittsburgh region educators in and out of school, early childhood through high school, people who were wrestling with what it is that we were learning about learning itself and beginning to appreciate that there was something different in kids' lives. That they were developing their identity differently, that they were seeking affirmation differently, that they were consuming and producing information differently, all driven by societal and technological changes. And what we noticed about these people who were themselves in schools as teachers, they were in libraries, they were in museums, is that there was something very Fred-like about them. They themselves were focused on what today we call whole child, right? The child development theory and practice that was so core to Fred Rogers' method. And yet they were also mindful about what it is that was attractive to kids, thinking about gaming and robotics and new technologies, much like the newfangled technology of television in Fred Rogers' experience. And so they were connecting with what was timeless and classic, with what was innovative, attractive, and really exciting to kids, and figuring out how do we merge these things. And it's that Fred method that we began to notice and talk about 15 years ago that sets the stage for this book all these years later, and the work really during the last 3 years.
Yeah, so over the last 3 years, we really started digging into what are now known as the learning sciences. So psychology and behavioral science and all these fields that inform how human beings learn. What we realized as we were looking into the learning sciences was that if you talk to some of the top scientists, or if you read some of the top research papers, scientists are talking about learning in ways that don't sound very scientific. Instead, they're talking about making sure kids feel safe. They're talking about making sure kids feel like they belong to a community that cares about them. They're talking about making sure kids feel loved and capable of loving. And it's interesting that the science sounds less like science and more like a script from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And when we put those two things together, I think that's really when we realized we had a book idea on our hands.
Now, I was going to ask you guys, why decide to write this book now? But you guys already answered that for me pretty much. So, when you guys decided to release this book, did you ever expect that Mr. Rogers would pretty much come back into the limelight again, especially over the years with The Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood being released and Won't You Be My Neighbor?
Yes and no. I mean, we were certainly cognizant enough that there was greater attention to the work of Fred Rogers, right? We could see it in the work of Fred Rogers Productions and the PBS television series, and we knew that Morgan Neville was preparing a documentary, that there was hope for at the time of a blockbuster film. But again, taking you back 3 or 4 years ago when this idea began to develop and the book proposal began to develop, I don't think we realized the way in which Fred Rogers would really come back to the forefront of American popular culture in the way that he has between book proposal and book release.
Yeah, there were a few moments, especially watching the documentary, when, at least personally, I thought, I wish we'd started a little bit earlier. I wish we could catch this wave of the Fred Rogers renaissance, you know? But the thing about Fred is that he's timeless, and he's not a fad. He's not the next big thing. He's been with us for so long. He's going to be with us, we hope, for decades to come. And so, although we sort of weren't in that window of the blockbuster blockbuster movie, the documentary, the biography. We're happy to make our contribution now, and I don't think we would have been able to write it in the way we did had all those other folks done all that amazing work 2 or 3 years ago.
And Colton, if I may, so in part, this is a book about Fred Rogers, right? Because it's about his blueprints for learning, capturing that whole child, capturing the learning sciences. But it's also a book about learning and community and the learning landscape that we want to create for our young people, their families, and our educators. And so in some ways, I'm hopeful we've made ourselves lucky, because this is what the world needs right now. As we emerge from this pandemic and we think about post-pandemic learning futures for our kids, who better to turn to than Fred Rogers and the blueprints that he began to develop 50 years ago? They are as timeless and classic and relevant now as ever, and maybe needed more than ever.